Word spread faster than Sean Miller had ever expected. Within days of pinning up the handwritten sign, "Veterans, no charge. Thank you for your service," the small, cracked parking lot outside his garage began to fill with worn-out cars, motorcycles covered in dust, pickup trucks sagging from decades of use. Some rolled in under their own power, others had to be towed, rattling and groaning like old men trying to stand up one more time. Sean never asked for proof. No discharge papers, no ID cards. A handshake and a nod were enough. If a man or woman said they had worn the uniform, that was all Sean needed to hear. He would wipe the grease from his hands on a rag that had seen better years, look them in the eye, and say, "We'll take care of it." It didn't matter if the job took an hour or a week. It didn't matter if the parts cost more than the customer could dream of paying. Each night, Sean worked long after the sun sank behind the scrubby trees, the garage bathed in the yellow glow of a single floodlight mounted above the battered service door. Inside, the radio played soft country songs that nobody sang along to, and the old lift creaked and groaned as he coaxed tired machines back to life. The veterans left quietly, some with tears they hid behind ball caps, some with a stiff handshake that lasted just a second too long. Sean never made a fuss about it. He didn't take photos. He didn't post about it online. He simply went back to work, day after day, greasy, bone-tired, and aching in places the military had taught him to ignore. But while the veterans came with gratitude, the town of Shelby grew less forgiving. At first, it was little things. Customers who used to bring their trucks in for oil changes stopped calling. Suppliers began asking for cash up front, no more generous 30-day terms. Friends who once shared beers on Saturday nights now looked away when Sean walked into the diner. Word spread, ugly and unstoppable, that Sean was exploiting veterans for attention, that he was running a charity stunt because he couldn't compete fairly, that he was making others look bad. Some said it quietly, some said it loud enough for him to hear. "You keep giving everything away, Miller, you'll be out of business by Christmas," a former friend had muttered, shaking his head and slamming down a beer glass one night at Marla's Tavern. "You think you're better than the rest of us?" Sean didn't argue. He knew from the army that sometimes the most dangerous enemy wasn't across the battlefield, it was standing next to you, wearing the same uniform, smiling the same smile. He kept his head down and worked harder. But no amount of hard work could stretch money that wasn't there. The pile of unpaid parts invoices grew like a mountain. Sean found himself skipping meals, rationing heating oil for the trailer, selling the last of his mother's belongings, a silver locket, a cedar hope chest, piece by painful piece. The lake house had been the final blow. He had fought so hard to keep it, the little place where he had once fished from the dock with his mother, where the walls still smelled faintly of cedar and lake water, where he had promised himself he would grow old in peace. But the garage needed a new transmission jack. The bills wouldn't pay themselves. So he signed the papers, handed over the keys, and moved into the trailer behind the garage. The trailer was old, leaning slightly to one side like it had given up long ago. The windows were drafty, the floor sagged, and the shower worked only if he jiggled the faucet just right. His cot sat next to a portable heater that coughed and sputtered on cold nights. A battered thermos sat by the door, his mother's, filled each morning with weak coffee he brewed on a dented hot plate. Every evening before collapsing into bed, Sean would stand outside for a moment, staring at the endless Texas sky, feeling the night wind whip against his tired face. It reminded him of nights in Iraq, sleeping under stars too big, too distant, while the desert swallowed sound and hope alike. He missed his mother most in those moments. Missed the way she had believed, with an unshakable certainty, that kindness mattered even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. The veterans kept coming. Some barely spoke a word, their eyes hollowed out by old wars and new worries. Some lingered after repairs were done, offering to sweep the garage or wipe down tools as payment. Sean let them, not because he needed the help, though he did, but because he knew they needed the dignity of offering something back. Over time, the resentment around town hardened. Someone slashed the tires on a veteran's car parked outside the shop. Another time, a brick was thrown through the small garage office window. No one claimed responsibility, but Sean didn't have to guess. He patched the window with plywood and went back to work. Even old friends who had once toasted him at the VFW hall began avoiding his eye. Some called him naive. Others called him a fool. But Sean Miller believed in something bigger than profit. He believed that a promise once made, to serve and protect, didn't end when the uniform came off. It lived on, quietly, stubbornly, in every oil-stained rag, every engine brought back to life, every free break job done for a man who couldn't stop shaking long enough to hold a coffee cup steady. And though the town might have forgotten, Sean remembered. He remembered every soldier who had sat with him in burning sands, every convoy that had needed just a little more luck to make it home, every brother and sister who hadn't. So he stayed. And he worked. And he waited, even as the weight of the world bore down heavier with each passing day. The coldest December winds swept across Shelby, Texas, biting through even the thickest denim and leather jackets. Sean worked through it all, bundled in an old army field coat with fraying cuffs, his breath hanging in the garage air like smoke. The heater in the shop had long since given up the fight, but Sean simply layered up, sliding under trucks and cars with fingers numbed by the cold, bolts slipping more often now from hands that once were steady enough to rebuild engines in the dead of desert nights. It was late on a Thursday, just past dusk, when the battered blue Ford pulled into the lot. Sean almost missed it. The truck was so quiet, barely a whisper compared to the clatter of the diesel engines he usually heard. It coughed and sputtered once before falling silent, as if giving up the last of its fight. The driver stepped out with the careful movements of an old soldier nursing old wounds. He was thin but carried a certain stiffness in his shoulders, a dignity that refused to bend under the weight of time. His jacket was plain, a nondescript gray that blended into the winter twilight. Sean wiped his hands on his rag, noting the limp as the man approached. There was something in the man's eyes, not fear, not exactly, but a wariness built from decades of watching his back. "Evening," Sean said, offering the man a nod. The man hesitated before speaking, his voice a quiet gravel that seemed to come from somewhere deep and scarred. "Truck's dying. Transmission slipping bad. Don't have much to pay." Sean looked at the truck, an old Ford F-150, the kind you couldn't K*LL unless you tried real hard. He looked back at the man and just nodded once more. "We'll get her running. Leave the keys in the tray. I'll see what I can do. No talk of money. No paperwork. Just the old way, the way Sean's mother had taught him." The man lingered after setting the keys down, seeming to weigh something heavy and unseen in the balance. Then, wordlessly, he reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled something small and silver, pressing it into Sean's grease-stained hand. Sean looked down. It was a coin, larger and heavier than a regular quarter, smooth at the edges from years of being thumbed over nervously. On one side, an eagle perched atop a shield, on the other, a series of Latin words Sean didn't immediately recognize, encircling an insignia that looked official, military, and unmistakably rare. Sean turned it over once, feeling the weight of it, the strange warmth it seemed to carry even in the biting cold. Before he could ask, the man gave a slight nod, more of an acknowledgement than a thank you, and disappeared into the night, his figure swallowed by the mist that had begun to creep in from the fields beyond town. Sean pocketed the coin without much thought, figuring it for a veteran's keepsake, maybe an old commemorative token. He made a mental note to keep it safe, though. It didn't feel like the kind of thing you threw in a drawer and forgot. He set to work on the truck that same night. The transmission was sh*T, worse than Sean expected. It would need a complete rebuild, parts he couldn't afford to order. But still, he tore into it under the sputtering light, hands blackened with grease, breath rising in short, sharp clouds. There was a strange calm that came over him as he worked on that truck, like a quiet hand resting on his shoulder. Time slipped away. The storm outside rattled the garage door. Somewhere a dog barked into the darkness. Sean kept working, tightening bolts, checking connections, finding focus that he hadn't felt in months. By sunrise, the job was halfway done, and Sean finally allowed himself a few hours of sleep curled up in the corner of the garage beneath his old army blanket. The silver coin stayed tucked into the breast pocket of his jacket, close to his heart, though he didn't know why he bothered to keep it there. Days passed. Sean continued fixing trucks and bikes for free, continued waking each morning to a colder garage, a thinner wallet, and a town that seemed to whisper more and more about his inevitable collapse. He mentioned the strange coin once to an old friend from his army days, a man who now worked security at a nearby base. Over beers in the back of the VFW, Sean pulled the coin from his jacket and handed it over. His friend whistled low under his breath, turning it carefully between his fingers. "You have any idea what this is?" he asked. Sean shook his head. "This ain't no souvenir. That's a Tier 1 coin, brother. You don't get handed one of these unless you've bled for something that don't even get written down." Sean frowned. "You mean like special ops?" "Yeah," his friend said, lowering his voice. "And not the kind they make movies about. Real black ops. Stuff that never makes the news. If someone gave you this, they didn't just say thanks. They marked you. They acknowledged you." Sean sat back, stunned. He thought about the old man's careful movements, the haunted look in his eyes, the sense that every step he took was deliberate, measured against risks Sean could barely imagine. He tucked the coin back into his jacket, feeling its familiar weight now heavy with new meaning. Still, he said nothing to the veterans who came in, or to the few customers who still trickled through the garage doors. He wore no badge. He posted no signs. He kept working, through the cold, through the pain, through the growing loneliness that seemed to creep closer with every sunset. The silver coin remained close, a silent, wordless promise that somewhere, someone had seen. Someone had remembered. And though Sean did not yet know it, that single act of kindness, repairing a truck for a stranger without asking a single question, had set into motion events far beyond anything the small town of Shelby could imagine. The cold wore on, day after day, as winter gripped Shelby in its rough, unforgiving hands. The heater in Sean's trailer sputtered and died entirely one night, leaving him to sleep under every blanket he owned, the thin walls groaning with each gust of icy wind. Morning came pale and brittle, and Sean rose without complaint, slipping into his grease-stained jacket, stuffing the silver coin into his chest pocket where it always rested now, close to the only warmth he trusted. The veterans kept coming. But the town's patience had thinned to a brittle shell that cracked a little more with every day Sean's garage stayed open. The local paper, once happy to publish puff pieces about community bake sales and church picnics, ran a quiet story one Sunday morning. It asked whether businesses were being undercut by reckless charity. No names were mentioned, but everyone knew. It wasn't hard to guess who the reckless one was. Customers who had once slapped Sean on the back now avoided his gaze in the grocery store aisle. Friends who had once raised toasts to his mother's memory now mumbled excuses about tight budgets and changing times. Even the veterans themselves sometimes hesitated before rolling into the cracked parking lot, casting nervous glances around, as if Sean's kindness were something contagious, something that might cost them too much if they accepted it. It started small, a customer who left without paying for a new alternator installation. Sean didn't chase him. He simply made a note in the battered ledger he kept under the counter, the one his mother had taught him to trust over any computer system. Then it grew meaner. The flyers for a veteran support drive that Sean hung in the hardware store window were torn down overnight. Handwritten signs appeared on telephone poles, warning about charity scams and businesses that give to some while charging others. One morning, Sean arrived at the garage to find that someone had smashed the tail lights of two veterans' cars waiting to be repaired. A heavy iron crowbar lay in the gravel, abandoned like a guilty conscience. Sean picked it up, weighing it for a moment in his calloused hand, before tossing it into the scrap bin without a word. He patched the tail lights with red tape and clear plastic, salvaging what he could, swallowing the cost himself. The men never knew. Sean made sure of that. By mid-January, the vandalism escalated. Someone had scrawled fraud across his garage door in bright red spray paint. It took Sean hours to scrub it away with chemical cleaner, the stinging fumes burning his eyes until they watered and blurred. Still, he refused to close the shop even for a single day. His trailer wasn't spared either. One night, while Sean worked late, a group of teenagers hurled rocks at the windows, shattering the thin panes and letting the freezing air pour in. By the time he stumbled out into the darkness, there was only laughter retreating into the night, echoing down the empty streets. Sean didn't call the police. He didn't file reports. He didn't post angry notes on the town bulletin board like others would have. He simply patched the windows with sheets of plywood scavenged from the back lot, hammering them into place by flashlight under a sky heavy with stars and silence. Inside, sitting at the small table wedged between the trailer's peeling kitchenette and his cot, he stared at his mother's photograph. A young woman in uniform, smiling in a way that promised hope even when surrounded by desert and danger. He wondered if she would tell him to quit, to fold, to save himself before there was nothing left. But in his bones, he knew she wouldn't. Kindness didn't come with conditions. It wasn't offered because it was easy, or profitable, or popular. It was offered because it was right. Each morning he returned to the garage, the same way he had returned to duty station after duty station, deployment after deployment, long after lesser men had found ways to excuse themselves. Still, the debts piled higher. Parts suppliers began refusing shipments until overdue invoices were cleared. Sean resorted to scavenging junkyards for parts, cannibalizing old engines and transmissions, rebuilding them with trembling fingers and stubborn pride. Meals became sparse, mostly cans of beans and stale bread he bought on discount. Coffee was a luxury he watered down to make it last longer, sipping it from his mother's battered thermos that still bore the faded emblem of her old unit. The loneliness seeped into him like cold into the bones. Long after the last veteran had driven away, long after the last wrench had been set down, Sean would sit alone in the garage office, staring at the wall lined with faded service posters, wondering how it had all unraveled so quickly. Sometimes he would touch the coin in his pocket, letting its smooth surface slide beneath his fingertips, a silent reminder that somewhere, somehow, his work mattered, even if the people around him had forgotten. The town's cruelty became a quiet backdrop to his days. Little things chipped away at him, the way cashiers would drop his change from a distance, the way conversations would hush when he entered a room, the way even kind faces now wore guarded expressions. Yet through it all, Sean never lashed out. He never raised his voice, never shamed the ones who had turned away. He believed, stubbornly, achingly, that patience and goodness were stronger than rumor and fear. He held on to that belief even when the bank called, informing him that the last loan extension had been denied. Even when the power company taped a final notice on the door. Even when he sat alone on the cracked front step of his garage, staring at the sunrise painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gold, knowing that within days, the shop, and everything he had built, would be gone. He waited there in that silence, the air trembling with things unsaid, as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting to watch him fall. The rain started before dawn, a cold, steady drizzle that darkened the cracked concrete of the garage lot and soaked through Sean's battered boots as he worked alone to tarp over an old Pontiac someone had abandoned weeks earlier. His fingers were stiff, numb with cold, and every muscle in his back ached with the weight of months of unpaid bills, broken friendships, and silent condemnation. He didn't even hear them at first, the rumble of heavy engines approaching in slow, deliberate unison. It was only when the ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble slightly that he straightened, squinting into the mist. 3 black SUVs, their windows tinted and bodies gleaming even in the rain, pulled into the lot. Behind them, more vehicles lined the road, town cars, military trucks, police cruisers. The street filled, and the watching town filled with it, pouring out of diners, shops, and homes, their breath fogging the cold air as they crowded the sidewalks, whispering, watching. Sean wiped his hands on the hem of his jacket, heart pounding in his ears, as the SUVs came to a stop. The doors opened in near-perfect unison. Men in dark suits and officers in full military dress stepped out. Their movements were purposeful, sharp, the kind of precision Sean hadn't seen since his own days in uniform. From the center vehicle emerged a woman in a dark blue coat, the seal of the United States emblazoned on her breast pocket. She walked with a bearing that spoke of years under scrutiny, of decisions made in rooms where no sunlight reached. Sean stood motionless as she approached, the entire town holding its collective breath behind him. Mr. Sean Miller, she said, her voice clear despite the rain, carrying across the parking lot to every ear, every doubting soul who had gathered to watch. On behalf of the Department of Defense and the Office of the Secretary of National Defense, I am authorized to deliver a formal recognition. Behind her, an aide stepped forward, unfolding a thick velvet box. Inside gleamed a medal few civilians had ever seen, the Distinguished Civilian Service Award, the highest honor the military could bestow on a civilian. The secretary turned slightly, her voice steady. Your unwavering service to veterans, your personal sacrifices made without expectation of reward or recognition, have not gone unnoticed. Your repairs, offered freely, humbly, and with dignity, allowed critical personnel and their families to remain safe, mobile, and operational. One of those you aided, she paused, her eyes softening, was the son of a senior Pentagon official. And another, Mr. Julian Hayes, was an operative whose silent contributions have saved countless American lives. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sean simply blinked, feeling the rain slide down his face, unsure whether it was rainwater or tears. An officer stepped forward next, holding a polished wooden plaque. On it, a simple engraving, "In quiet service, we find true valor." Sean stared at it, overwhelmed, every hardship of the past year pressing against his chest all at once. Then something even more unexpected happened. One by one, the veterans Sean had helped emerged from the crowd, men and women in battered jackets, wheelchairs, and crutches, wearing medals tarnished by time but shining now in the gray light. They lined up behind him without a word, forming a wall of silent, weathered support. And behind them, others from the town began to step forward. The diner owner who had once refused to serve Sean coffee slipped through the crowd, his hat clutched tightly in trembling hands. The parts supplier who had cut off his shipments pushed forward too, eyes downcast, shame written across his lined face. One by one, the skeptics, the critics, the cowards came forward, standing not to speak, not to justify, but simply to be present, to bear witness to the quiet man who had proven them all wrong. In the heavy silence that followed the secretary's final words, Sean felt something shift, not a roar, not a cheer, but a deeper, more enduring thing. Respect. It hung in the air like the scent of wet earth after long drought, like a breath finally released after too long held. The secretary pinned the medal onto Sean's jacket, the rain soaking through his clothes but not dampening the fierce, raw light that seemed to burn from within him now. Later that week, national newspapers picked up the story. Television crews camped outside his garage. Offers poured in, franchise opportunities, investment deals, interviews, book contracts. Sean turned them all away. Instead, he founded a nonprofit foundation dedicated to teaching returning veterans automotive skills, offering free repairs to those in need, and building community workshops where service members could find purpose again. He hired fellow veterans, men and women who knew the grind, the silence, the unspoken grief. The battered chair stayed in the garage office. The same battered lift groaned beneath the same battered trucks. And Sean's mother's sign, the simple piece of cardboard scrawled with a permanent marker, remained taped to the window. Veterans, no charge. Thank you for your service. In time, the town of Shelby changed too. Businesses that had once turned their backs now donated supplies. Schools invited veterans to speak. Memorials were erected. The spirit Sean had reignited spread, slow and steady, a fire that refused to go out. But Sean remained the same. Quiet. Steady. Anchored by a faith his mother had taught him, that real kindness didn't need an audience. It needed only to be done. Long after the cameras left, after the reporters packed up and the medals tarnished with time, Sean continued to work, one car, one life, one small act of service at a time. Because some debts could never be repaid. And kindness, real kindness, was its own reward. It always had been. It always would be.